Hi, everyone, and welcome to chapter 4 of How Languages Are Learned by Lightbound and Nina Spada. In this chapter, we will discuss how second language learning occurs. We wanted to know more about how it happens and what are the different perspectives that we can use in order to understand this complex process of language learning. In this chapter, we have three different perspectives: behavioral perspectives, the cognitive perspectives, and also the social perspectives. We're going to discuss all of them and see how each perspective can help us understand this complex process. And also, we're going to see some application based on each approach and how we're going to use this in the language learning uh, applications, like in classrooms, if we're teaching, or even if we are trying to learn a second language. So, for the behaviorist perspective, uh, this perspective explains that the language learning happens, especially second language acquisition, occurs as a result of imitation, repeated practice, and reinforcement, having a lot of feedback and also forming new habits in the language. Because when we learn the first language, we already have some habits in place. So when you try to pick up a new language, what happens is you try to break these linguistics habits or try to add new ones for the new learning context. So one of the application based on this approach is the audiolingual teaching methodology or learning methodology. And this approach focused mainly on listening and speaking. It came up as a reaction to the translation-based approach, which focused more on writing and reading. That's why in this approach, it focuses on mimicry and memorization. It started in the military because think about it, if you're going to send some soldiers to a foreign country and you need them to be able to understand the way people are using the language, like the dialect of the language, not the formal aspect of the language, not the textbook language, but the language everyone uses in their daily life activities or experience. So this approach was so dominant to foreign language teaching from the 40s to the 70s, especially in North America. And it underlines repeated practice through mimicry, just like you need to follow all the pronunciation, the tones, the rhythm of the native speaker, and also you have to memorize it. You have to try to be as close as possible to a native speaker in all the language related aspects. And it depends on forming these habits in the new language and trying to overcome the interference from the first language habits. And looking at this approach, we kind of feel like it depends on the idea of the differences and the expected errors that will be made in the learning process based on the first language, which we discussed already in chapter 2 when we talked about the contrastive analysis hypothesis, that most of the learner errors are predictable based on their linguistic background. However, researchers found that many learner errors are not predictable based on first language alone. And also, we highlighted that first language influence is not simply a matter of habit, but it's more complicated as a process. And that's why when we discussed the contrastive analysis hypothesis, we rejected it as one of the hypotheses that could be accepted for expecting the developmental stages that a learner goes through in their learning journey, which also represents some kind of rejection of the behavioral approach. And that's why this approach, the audiolingual approach, started to be less popular, but later on it came back again in many different forms, but it hasn't been just like adopted as a more practical teaching methodology of language since the 70s. So one of the implication of this approach is the shadowing teaching strategy or learning strategy, wherein you would listen to a song or a learner, let's say a second language learner, listens to a song, or even to TV clip or a TV show or whatever for 2 or 3 minutes, and they try to mimic what the actors or what the speaker says, try to keep everything as close as possible to the way they speak the language, like in terms of pauses, in terms of the tone, in terms of the rhythm, in terms of pace, everything, and even in terms of filler, adding, kind of all of this kind of thing. Moving on to the second approach, which is the innatist approach. And we already discussed this approach in this first part of the course when we handled or when we discussed in detail the nature approach. And we said this approach is derived from Chomsky's ideas on language of first language acquisition. And based on his view, children have innate knowledge of certain principles which govern all languages, known as universal grammar. And what happens is this universal grammar permits all children to acquire language during a critical period. However, we haven't seen any mentioning in Chomsky's theories about second language acquisition or even the implication of his theory of second language acquisition. However, other innatists highlighted some of the point that could be related to the second language acquisition. For example, Cook in 2004 highlighted that universal grammar is also the basis for second language acquisition. So remember when we discussed the idea of the language parameter and setting parameter, like if we have like some kind of a switch and you need to set up the parameter for the language in place. So we can use the same concept for learning a second language. Let's say, for example, I started, my first language is English, and in this case, I know the subject comes first, and I decide to learn, let's say, another language, which the object comes first. So in this case, universal grammar is still in effect. We can still use it. We can still make use of the parameter, the principles of universal grammar, but also we need to form new habits by, okay, instead of having the subject at first, it can come in the middle or even at the end of the sentence. Also, others argued that universal grammar is no longer available for second language acquisition. And that also makes some sense because, as we said, the critical period hypothesis predicts that all the innate mechanism, universal grammar principles, which facilitates language learning, first language learning, is significantly uh, come down, like to almost less, to be less effective around the period of puberty. So still we don't know for sure if it's still effective, available for second language acquisition, especially with older or adult learners. White in 1991 and others highlighted that prior knowledge of first language changes how universal grammar affects second language acquisition. And that also makes sense because if you think about it, we still have like the idea of principles and parameters, which have already been set up or determined by the first language. And that's why the prior knowledge impacts some way, shape, or form the second language acquisition. One of the intriguing and thought-provoking applications of second language acquisition, of the innatist approach, is proposed by Stephen Krashen's. And Krashen is one of the, I would say, influential people when it comes to second language acquisition. So he proposed a monitor model to explain second language acquisition process. And in this model, he proposed 5 hypotheses. The first one is that acquisition is not the same as learning. And an easy way of understanding the difference between them is acquisition is usually happens unconsciously. You are being exposed to the language. You are just like, think about the first language. That's more of an acquisition. We are not giving instruction to children, but they are picking up the language gradually, and they start their production of the language output like in just like in a gradual way. And that's why we said they go through different stages, such as one word stage, 2 word stage, and then we have the vocabulary out uh, burst or explosion, and then we're having morphological feature, syntactic feature, and then by the age of 5, we're having more a complex system coming to fruition and being used by the children. While learning, on the other hand, is more of conscious way of interacting with the language. Think of taking a course or having a tutor or having someone who's giving you feedback. That's more of learning than being acquiring the language in a natural way. The second hypothesis is the monitor editor hypothesis. And based on that, he said, what happens is this editor or this monitor that we have, the knowledge, the learned knowledge that we have of the second language acts like a monitor that helps us to make minor changes in order to meet the requirement of the communicative activity we are involved in. The third hypothesis is the natural order principle, which is all the people from different linguistic background go through the different stages. So let's say, for example, the idea of the more difficult or challenging, let's say, for example, forming complex sentences or forming interrogative acts or questions might be taking much time than learning to do the negation in the language. So there is some kind of natural order of acquiring different features in the language, and that applies to all the people from different linguistic background. The fourth hypothesis is based on the idea of comprehensible input, which represents the core of second language learning. So the main idea behind the comprehensible input is that when you are introducing information or when you are being exposed to information in the second language, try to make sure that you understand this input. And for example, let's say, for example, I'm learning Spanish or I'm learning French. So since I don't know many words in French, if I started to say something like, je suis très content pour te voir, or if I say something like, je vis à la maison. So by saying this utterance in the second language, you don't know what I'm talking about, right? But if I use my gesture and even I may start like I have a piece of paper or the on the board, I started to draw some cues that help you understand what I'm talking about. Or if I'm telling you a story and then in the story I'm just like using pointing to each what I'm talking about. Like let's say, for example, a donkey or a cat. I'm using the word and also I'm using gesture in order to help you do with this. So for the other two sentences I said in French, I might say something like this. And let's say, for example, let me do something here to make it meaningful a little bit. So let's say, for example, here I started to use something like a drawings or something. So here I draw a man and he's walking a little bit, and here I have a house. And I said, je, which means I, and then V, I'm going, and then the house, à la maison, the house. So now by using these cues, that would be a comprehensible input for you, because now you can see that je means I, which is a person who's speaking, the first person speaking. And then V, it's a verb, which means go. And then we're having à la maison, means to, the maison, the house. So now you can make some sense out of what I'm saying, and instead of just like hearing incomprehensible sequence of utterances. That's comprehensible input. So when you're introducing or when you are trying to acquire a language, try to be exposed to comprehensible input, something that you can understand, and that is going to help with the acquisition process. Finally, the last hypothesis he highlighted is the affective filter. And based on his argument, like especially with the adult learner or the older learner of second language, the idea of self-image plays a very significant role, and maybe we are just like more reluctant to practice the language because we are a little bit nervous, we're a little bit stressed, we are thinking of the negative feedback we're going to receive. And that's why having this affective filter might impact our progress and development as second language learner. And that's why being aware of this affective filter and knowing how to drop this filter and practice the language no matter what helps your development as second language learner. Think about like as a kid, when you learn your first language, you don't care about the mistakes. Or even in the kindergarten, all the students or the kids in the kindergarten preschools make tons of mistakes and they don't care because they don't have this affective filter. But as we grow up, we keep this affective filter and we start to be nervous if we make mistakes because we're thinking too much about our self image and what people will say about us. So, Stephen Krashen's monitor approach, in fact, is very interesting and thought-provoking. However, it has been challenged by other researchers and theorists as being not empirical or something that we can test it out, and especially like some of the hypotheses. Some studies have been conducted, in fact, on the affective filter, especially Zoltan Dornez have done a lot of studies on that. But still, some of them are just like something that is we cannot have more empirical, authentic research to verify them. However, one of the main takeaways from this approach is moving away from the form-based focus to the communicative approaches to language teaching. So, as we have seen in the behavioral approach, we focus so much on mimicry and memorization. But here we focus much on input, understanding, and also dropping the affective filter and start to practice the language in a natural way, in a first language model way. So, classroom research on second language learning confirms that students can make considerable progress through exposure to comprehensible input, but it's not efficient. It's not sufficient by itself to only have comprehensible input. Still, an structural intervention is also important for second language acquisition. The second approach is the cognitive perspectives. And this cognitive perspective looks at the language as more of the mind as more of a computer. So the idea of keeping the information, processing the information, storing the information, integrating it, and retrieving it when needed. So in contrast to the innatist approach, the cognitive one doesn't assume a mental module devoted specifically for language acquisition. Rather, all language learning and thinking are based on the same cognitive processes. And that's why first language learning and second language learning draw on the same learning processes, but the circumstances of learning and of learning both of them, like especially of learning and second language learners' prior knowledge of first language, shapes their perception of second language. So in this approach, we have different models and we're having different hypotheses. One of them is the information processing. And based on this approach, language acquisition gradually is building up knowledge through exposure to second language. And new information must be noticed and to be processed before it can be learned. And less learning is happening with no noticing. That's why we need to notice, we need to be aware of a linguistic form in order to learn it. And also, one of the points that they highlighted is there is a limit on how much information a learner can pay attention to at once. So you cannot just like give them more information and have like let them experience a cognitive load. Just like what you need to do to give them some time to process the new information and also to be aware of using this information. So let's say, for example, you're learning tenses in English. So instead of teaching all the tenses together, or instead of learning all the tenses together in the language, what you need to know is to know each one of them separately. Like, let's say, for example, when to use it, how to form it, and what does it mean. And then you move on. So now you're giving yourself some time to process the information, maybe also to see the differences between this and the first language that you already have in place, and also to be aware of how to use it. And that's why they said we're having skill learning happening when we are processing new information. So this new information needs to be internalized first as a declarative knowledge, which is the knowledge that we need to pay attention to the form, to be aware of the information, and that we can report noticing it. And then we start to practice this new information, and by practicing it, what happens is a new form of knowledge is being formed, which is procedural knowledge. And this knowledge is the ability to use the information appropriately in new context. So with further practice, the information can be accessed automatically, and later on, the learner forgets even having learned it, because now it moves from being aware into subconscious learning, because you already have processed the information, you already have used the information, practiced the information, and then it turns to be unconscious. Also, through this information processing, some restructuring might be happening down the road. So not all the information, not all the knowledge seems to follow the declarative procedural automatic path of knowledge. What happens is a learner may practice something for a while, and then they may fail to use it when they acquire new knowledge. So maybe there is some kind of backslide into the wrong form. So maybe just like after you hearing them many times say sentences like I saw or I went, a learner may begin to use the regular past ending of those irregular verbs as well. You might hear them saying I seed or I goed. So this process of restructuring represent progress, in fact, even though it may result in new errors in language and in learner language. Also, some transfer appropriate processing is happening, especially when we learn something and we also internalize the condition under which it is learned and the cognitive processes involved in learning it, which means we recall something more easily when the context and the processes for recall are similar to those in which we originally learned it. Another perspective, another view based on the cognitive perspective is the usage-based learning. And we have already discussed this in the first part of the course when we highlighted the nurture part of the language acquisition. So based on this, learning is the gradual establishment and strengthening of links between bits of information. So what happens is like word order or word and object and words that come together and words and the grammatical markers. So all the learning is based on the same cognitive processes. We don't have any innate mechanism. Just like it's a matter of being exposed frequently to the language forms. And that's why the frequency with which the information is encountered is a strong predicator of how easily it will be learned. Also, there is the competition model. And this competition model has been proposed to account for both L1 and L2. And based on that through exposure, learners understand how to use the cues, like the word order, that languages use to signal specific functions. And that's why, for example, as we discussed in first language acquisition, the agent comes first in a sentence. So in English, we say it's the agent first. So whenever we are trying to understand the sentence meaning, we know whoever occupies the first position in the sentence is the agent, not the patient, not the object. And that's why you're using all of these cues in order to understand how the language works and to understand its functions. And that happens when you, this competition models, like all the time happens when we are being introduced to languages that are contrastive or contrasted with each other when it comes to the word order. So English and Italian, for example, or English and Arabic, or English and Hebrew, for example, to interpret odd sentences, English speakers tend to use word order, and the Italian speaker, for example, use anemisi with a sentence like this sentence in Italian. So here, the toy sta guardando il bambino. So I know this like il bambino, that means the boy. So the toy is looking at the child, or to the Italian speaker, the child is looking at the toy. So if we consider this as being the agent, it doesn't make sense to us. But to the Italian, they have some features that indicate whoever in the sentence that has this feature is the agent. It might come in initial position, in middle position, or even in the final position of the sentence. Arabic, or I guess Arabic, Hebrew, Arabic, I guess, is the same because you might have the subject in initial position, or in the middle, or at the end. And even you can start with the object, just like this sentence in Italian. So this competition, what happens is we try to understand the language use or the language function based on the cues that we collect based on the being exposed to different forms of the language expressions or utterances. So also understanding how language is processed or how language is being acquired is connected closely with the brain. So we need to know which function or which parts of the brain are responsible for that. So current research challenges the assumption that language functions are located in the left hemisphere of the brain. So if you accept the theory of the left-minded people, the right-minded people, based on this categorization, language is mainly in the left hemisphere of the brain. And the people who are speaking more than one language, they are using this, they are more of left-minded people. However, the current research highlighted that it's not the left hemisphere of the brain, but multiple regions of the brain are activated and when language is processed. Differences have been observed between these areas, especially when it comes to L1 and L2. And research shows activation of different brain regions in relation to explicit and implicit instruction. And that was so interesting. However, although it's still premature to base second language teaching on brain research. So now we have more like new technologies are providing more information about the brain and the language. Now we have eye tracking, now we have AI coming, like evolving in a way that is just like unexpected before. So all of these are giving us newer insights about language and how we process and which region of the brain are activated, especially when it comes to explicit and implicit teaching practices. So some of the application based on this perspective includes the interaction hypothesis, the noticing hypothesis, the input processing, the processability theory, and the role of practice. So in the interaction hypothesis, inputs become comprehensible not only through modified language in the input, but through modified interaction. And that's why using the language in context is way effective than just like memorizing the language or you like mimicking the native speakers. So that's why when you are learning the language or when you are teaching second language learner, you might end up using different forms of modified interaction. You might ask comprehension questions, comprehension checking questions, or even clarification requests, or even self-repetition and paraphrase, or even giving feedback to let the learner know when communication fails. The noticing hypothesis is so interesting. And we already have talked a little bit about it when we highlighted the idea of information processing. So, according to this hypothesis, nothing is learned unless it is noticed. Think about it. When we learn to drive a car, just think about the first time you start to learn how to drive a car. You were paying attention, you were just like 100% focused on what to do, what are you doing, and what you need to do next. Even when I remember when I started to learn how to drive, I wasn't able to be engaged in a side conversation with someone who was sitting in the passenger seat. I was just like so focused on like the wheel and also the brake and also the gas and the traffics and everything around me. And you ended up learning it because you were aware of everything you're doing. So based on this, nothing is learned until or unless it is noticed, it is understood, it is being recognized, and then you become fully aware of how it works, and then you adopt it to be a part of your, again, functioning system. So the question of whether a learner must be aware that they are noticing something is the object of considerable debate. But still, it makes sense. Like, I have done some research on this, especially the noticing hypothesis, and I wanted to see how my students, especially when they are involved in group work, highlight to each other errors or mistakes in their writing and how they overcome this knowledge gaps and how their writing improves later on based on this noticing hypothesis. However, it's still difficult to measure noticing, but with the new technology and the innovative methods that now exist, including eye tracking, it becomes more practical and more doable. Also, input processing, it's closely related to the noticing hypothesis, but the main idea here is that how difficult or easy processing the input is. So learners have difficulty focusing on form and meaning at the same time. And that's why what we need to highlight that learners pay attention mainly to the meaning first, and later on the form will come. It will become part of it. And that's why making mistakes when they mean something else, it's okay. So the input processing instruction forces learner to pay attention to the form. And because in this part of the learning, what happens is now they know the meaning, now they know what they want to say, and now they wanted to choose the right form. So the processing the input makes them more aware of the correct way of doing that according to the communicative act they are in. Also, the processability theory highlights that some language features, like syntax and morphology, are acquired in a predictable developmental sequence. Remember when we discussed in the previous chapter acquiring relative clauses or acquiring questions or acquiring negation. So also in this theory, we're having that teachability hypothesis, which focuses on the idea that developmental features of language can be successfully taught only when learners are developmentally ready. So we need to understand the different stages that they go through, and also they need to be at the level that they are able to acquire or learn the new stage. And some language features are variational, like not subject to any developmental sequence and can be taught at any time. Think about tenses, for example, or writing a simple sentence, and compare this with the other syntactic features or other morphological features of plural, or even the negation, or even the complex sentences or compound complex sentences. So it depends on which features and how many stages that learner go through in order to process the information and to be able to retrieve the information later on. Practice is very influential in language acquisition. And one of the drawbacks of the audiolingual instruction was that practice often separated language form from meaningful language use. As we said, it highlights mimicking and also memorization of language forms, like memorizing a chunk of information without even processing them. And from a cognitive perspective, practice is not mechanical, and it shouldn't be restricted to production. It should be relevant to communication, and it should be meaningful. And that's why, based on this approach, any practice you're doing for the language processing or language acquisition, either you're a student or a teacher, what you need to do, make your practice interactive, making it meaningful, and focusing on task essential forms. And this practice should involve learners in doing what they want to get better at, especially understanding and producing meaningful language. Finally, we have the sociocultural perspective. And this perspective is based on Vygotsky's theory, sociocultural theory of learning. And this theory also started like back in the 70s or the 80s, late 80s, because he's Russian and his work started to be translated into English around mid 70s. So, based on this, cognitive development results from social interaction. Any kind of learning, any kind of development is mediated through some symbols or artifacts. That's the main hypothesis of the theory. And that's why the main principles in this theory is the idea of mediation. And this mediation could happen through symbols or an artifact. So let's say, for example, I don't know how to drive. You have two options to be mediated through this learning how to drive. You might read a book, the handbook of the traffic guidelines, let's say. That's the artifact, reading a book or watching a TV show or YouTube tutorials, or take a course and someone is tutoring you how to do this. That would be the interactional part, the simple part, the language part. So any cognitive development results from this mediation. Another principle in under this theory is the idea of scaffolding, which means think of building like you are building something or you're acquiring a new skill. So today you learn a new skill and a new trick. Tomorrow you learn another trick. The next day, a third trick, the fourth trick. And then this is how learning is happening. It's just like building a new house. You need to have foundation, but also you need to have some kind of a scaffolding. Someone is giving you support or something. And the third principle is the idea of zone of proximal development. And according to this theory, learning occurs through interaction in the learner's zone of proximal development. And this zone of proximal development includes two levels: your actual level and the level you are aspiring to reach. So this is where you are right now. And now with some kind of help of a teacher or reading a book or taking a course, you will make it to this level. So that's the idea of proximal zone of proximal development. It's doable, but it's not difficult to achieve. So what happens is learners co-construct knowledge through interaction rather than processing input from the outside. So you are interacting, you're receiving support, and that's why you are developing and you're reaching the higher level. So now, let's say, for example, you started with stage one of negation, and you don't know, all the time you're saying no, no sugar in my tea, let's say, for example, instead of don't add or don't put sugar. So now through interaction, maybe the next time with some tutoring, you're going to receive the second level of this and you're going to use it. And then your level is going up as long as you're getting more support. And one of the application of this theory is the learning by talking, because the main tenet of this theory is the idea of talking or the idea of mediational interaction. So traditionally, development in the zone of proximal development was thought to occur through interaction between an expert and a novice. An expert in this case might be a teacher, might be a tutor, might be a book, and a novice, which in this case is the second language learner, the student. But is it only the tutor and the teacher? Is it only the teacher and the students? Is it only the teacher and learner? But now, based on many studies, also this zone of proximal development reaching a higher level is also doable and achievable through interaction between novice and novice. Think about any group project you work in. You come to this, like to work with this in this project with some perspective. And then while you are working with the group, you might see other perspective. You might listen to new ideas. You might see things differently. You might think about new approaches to discuss the assignment. You might think of adding new perspective based on the discussion that you guys have. You might receive feedback from your peers or your classmates. Think of also the peer review session that you participated in. That's a novice interaction. You're giving feedback to your classmates, is giving feedback to you. So the teacher is not there. So based on this theory, this development can happen when we have this interaction between a teacher, an expert, and a novice, or between a novice and a novice interaction. And the research investigating, especially the zona proximal, the ZPD research investigates how learners co-construct knowledge while engaged in collaborative dialogues that focuses on form and meaning at the same time. So I worked on a project last semester. It was about collaborative writing. So what I did, I gave my students a writing task, and I asked them to work in groups of three or four maximum. And I asked them at the end about their perception. And some of the things that they highlighted, I wouldn't have done this task that good if I have done it individually. Meaning, and when I asked why, most of the responses were something like, because working with people gives me different perspective. We come up with different ideas. We were able to address more feedback in the limited time that we had than what I could do by myself. So what during this work, what happened is they were co-constructing knowledge together. They were fixing each other mistakes. They were coming up with new ideas. They were elaborating on one another contribution to the task. And that's why their writing became better than doing this individually. So in conclusion, in this chapter, we have seen different perspectives and theories, principles to account for second language learning. The upside of seeing all of this, now you have different lenses, different perspective that you can use when you are trying to learn a second language or when you are teaching people who are learning second language. However, educator like hoping that theories will give them insight in practice, but they are more frustrated by the lack of an agreement. As we see, we have different ways of explaining how it works and to account for the learning process. But then, like, look at this from a very positive perspective that now you have different ways of doing your lesson plans or even engaging in class activities or assigning some kind of writing task or speaking tasks or listening tasks or getting your students to work together in order to see this proximal development and mediation. So now at some point you can use the cognitive approach, at some point you can use the sociocultural approach, at some point if the other two approaches are not that effective, you can switch to more of like the monitor model approach or even the behavioral approach. So now you have different ways of understanding how complex the language is, but also different perspective to incorporate all of them in your knowledge tool set and to use it in a variety of context. So the good news is now we're having more of a growing body of applied research that draws on a wide range of theoretical orientations. And that's likely to be more helpful as guiding teachers' reflection about teaching and learning practices and also the pedagogy of language learning. So that's all about the fourth chapter.